The first rays of the sun stretched lazily across the cold, trembling earth. Mist clung to the valleys like forgotten memories, curling around jagged rocks and the gnarled roots of ancient trees. Somewhere, in that quiet wilderness, the distant trumpeting of a giant beast broke through the stillness, vibrating through the bones of the hunters who crouched in shadow. They were not like the animals they pursued. They were fragile, barely more than humans, wrapped in furs, armed with sticks sharpened to a point, hearts pounding, breath visible in the crisp morning air. And yet, there was a courage in their eyes that burned brighter than any fire they had ever known. No one had ever faced such a creature before. Not like this, not together. It was bigger than any human had ever dreamed, a mass of muscle and tusk, thick skin that gleamed wet in the morning light. And here they were, a small band of hunters, their lives poised on the edge of a spear, a dance with death they did not fully understand. They moved slowly, deliberately, every step measured. A crackling of dry leaves underfoot might mean the end, yet still they pressed on. Their elders had whispered stories by the fire, tales of beasts that could crush a man with a flick of their trunk, yet here, in the shadows of history itself, these whispers became a reality. The ground shook beneath the mammoth's footsteps, the rhythm of an ancient heartbeat calling out across the plains. A young hunter, barely more than a boy, paused and drew his breath slowly, trying to calm the chaos of fear and anticipation in his chest. He thought of his family, of the small hut by the river where his mother prepared roots and meat, of the laughter of children playing among the rocks. He knew that today they might not see the sun set again. And yet, something inside him stirred, a feeling older than fear, older than hunger, a spark of pride, of purpose, of connection to something immense and unforgiving. They surrounded the mammoth, moving like shadows. The beast's enormous tusks gleamed under the rising sun, and each breath it exhaled created a cloud of steam in the morning air. The hunters had studied it, followed it, learned its habits. And now, finally, it was time. Spears were raised, ropes in hand, hearts in throats, and a silence fell over the valley so complete it seemed the world itself held its breath. And then, the hunt began. The mammoth charged, and the ground seemed to quake beneath its weight. Hunters scattered, darted to either side, rolling over rocks and snapping branches. A spear struck the side just enough to pierce the thick hide, and the creature trumpeted in pain and rage. Dust rose in clouds around them, coating eyes, mouths, and fur in a gritty, choking haze. Yet the hunters did not falter. Every movement, every grunt, every step was part of a rhythm older than memory itself, a dance between life and death, predator and prey, courage and instinct. Hours passed. Time became strange, stretched and compressed in the relentless pulse of survival. Some hunters fell, some clawed their way back from the brink, their bodies torn and bleeding, their faces smeared with mud and sweat. And still, they pressed on. Each spear thrown, each rope pulled, each coordinated movement brought them closer, ever closer to a victory that seemed almost impossible. The sun dipped lower, painting the sky with bruised shades of purple and orange. The mammoth faltered, exhaustion creeping into its massive limbs. And finally, in a final desperate surge, the hunters worked together, every heart and mind focused, every body straining, until the great beast collapsed onto the earth with a trembling thud that shook the very ground beneath them. Silence returned, heavy and sacred, broken only by the laboured breaths of the hunters and the faint whimpering of the fallen giant. They stood there for a long while, staring, not yet daring to move. It was over, and yet it was only the beginning. The first great hunt had been won, but the lessons, the fear, the knowledge of life and death would linger in their bones forever. They had touched something primal, something immense, and in that touch they were changed. After the mammoth finally lay still, a strange quiet settled over the land. It wasn't the easy kind of quiet, like the lull after a storm, but a heavy, reverent silence that seemed to stretch over the plains and into the hearts of the hunters. Some leaned against the rough bark of trees, chests heaving, staring at the fallen giant as though it were a monument rather than prey. Others sank to the ground, letting the dust cling to their sweat-slicked skin, hands trembling, trying to comprehend what had just happened. The oldest of the hunters, a man whose back was bent and face lined with years of sun and wind, stepped forward, running his fingers along the coarse hair of the mammoth. He murmured something, words lost to time but carried with weight. Perhaps a prayer, perhaps reflection, perhaps just a whisper of awe. The younger hunters watched, uncertain, learning without realizing they were learning. Every gesture, every careful movement, every soft breath in the shadow of the beast was a lesson in survival, in respect, in the strange and fragile balance between life and death. Slowly they began to work together to prepare the body. It was not a task of brutality alone, but of reverence. The first cuts were precise, careful, each one guided by experience, instinct, and a kind of quiet intuition that humans had been honing for thousands of years. They stripped the meat, saved the hide, measured and marked, understanding that every part of this creature would provide sustenance, warmth, and tools for survival. Nothing would go to waste. They had stared death in the face, and now they were shaping life from it. As they worked, the sky shifted. Clouds rolled in like grey waves, softening the sunlight to a dim, silvery glow. The wind carried the scent of earth, blood, and something older, almost forgotten, weaving it through the grasses and around the hunters. Somewhere in the distance, the low howl of a wolf echoed, and a shiver passed through the group, not entirely from cold. They were part of a world that did not pause for them, that did not forgive, that demanded vigilance and respect at every turn. And yet, even in that raw, unforgiving environment, they laughed quietly at small successes, passing morsels of food, teasing one another softly, their humanity threading through the tension, grounding them in a fragile sense of normalcy. Night fell slowly, brushing the horizon with indigo and the soft orange of fading light. Fires were lit carefully, small and controlled, their glow flickering across faces lined with dirt and determination. The mammoth lay nearby, silent now, monumental and eternal, a reminder of the audacity and fragility of human life. They ate, drank from small streams and huddled together, letting warmth pass from body to body. Words were few, eyes met eyes, and stories began in murmurs, tales of hunts long past, of elders who had faced dangers that now seemed like distant echoes, of children yet to be born who might someday remember, if only in myth, what it was like to stand against the unimaginable. In those long hours of night, the young hunter who had felt both fear and pride earlier could not sleep. He stared into the fire, letting the shadows dance across the ground, and wondered what had driven them to take such risks. Was it hunger? Was it necessity? Or was it something deeper, older than the mammoth itself? An unspoken desire to measure themselves against the world, to leave a mark, to prove that they existed not just as bodies, but as thinking, feeling beings capable of bravery. The questions hung in the air, unanswered, and that was somehow comforting. The world was vast, dangerous, and beautiful, and they were a part of it. The elders spoke quietly, their voices low and melodic, almost a lullaby against the backdrop of the crackling fire. They told stories not of victories, but of lessons. How to watch, how to wait, how to respect the creatures that roamed the land. Each story was a thread, weaving the hunters into a tapestry that stretched far beyond their small camp, connecting them to generations before and those yet to come. In every word there was caution, admiration, sorrow, and pride, all mixed together in a gentle rhythm that matched the flicker of the flames and the whisper of the wind. Sleep finally came in fragments. Some curled close to the fire, some laid near the fallen mammoth, Others simply leaned back against the earth, eyes half closed, listening to the symphony of the night. Every rustle in the brush, every distant howl, every crack of a branch reminded them of how alive the world was, how delicate and fleeting their existence. And yet, for the first time in a long while, there was a sense of accomplishment, a thread of something like peace woven through exhaustion. They had faced the unimaginable, survived it, and learned from it. And as the fire dwindled to embers, one could almost imagine the mammoth stirring in the dreams of the hunters. Not alive, not threatening, but as a memory, a teacher, a monument to what it meant to risk everything and come through the other side changed, stronger, wiser, and more deeply connected to the pulse of the world around them. The next morning arrived quietly, almost hesitantly, as if the world itself wanted to linger in the shadow of what had been accomplished. Mist hung low over the plains again, clinging to grass and rocks, curling around the legs of the hunters as they rose and shook off the remnants of sleep. Their bodies ached in ways that no words could fully capture. Muscles pulled and joints stiffened, but there was a stubborn pride beneath the exhaustion. They had faced something enormous, something that could have ended them in an instant, and yet here they were, still breathing, still moving, still alive. They gathered near the mammoth, inspecting their work from the day before. The sun filtered through the mist, soft and forgiving, revealing the intricacies of the cuts, the careful preservation of hide, the strategic placement of ropes and tools. Everything had meaning. Every action was deliberate, not just for survival, but for understanding, an education in the ancient art of living in harmony with danger. Some of the younger hunters touched the hide, tracing it with tentative fingers, marvelling at its strength and texture. They whispered to one another softly, tentative laughter mingling with awe. This was not merely food, this was a teacher, a connection to the world, and a mirror reflecting their own courage and fragility. As they worked, they shared small stories. One hunter spoke of a river they had crossed months before, the water so cold it had stung like fire, yet the memory of the journey brought warmth now, a reminder of resilience. Another whispered about a storm that had passed over the hills, how they had huddled together, waiting for lightning to strike, hearts racing with fear and wonder. Each story carried more than entertainment. It carried lessons, survival instincts hidden in narrative, the subtle teaching of how to read the world and one another. By midday, the sun had burned away the mist, leaving the hunters sweating under its steady gaze. They moved with care, lifting meat, hauling ropes, securing hides. Even in this labour, there was a rhythm, a gentle cadence to their actions that matched the slow, deliberate pace of life in this harsh but beautiful world. Every glance, every gesture, every shared breath was part of an unspoken bond that tied them together more tightly than any rope or spear. They were a unit, fragile yet resilient, held together by necessity, trust, and the silent understanding that their survival depended not only on skill but on each other. Later, as the shadows lengthened, the hunters paused. Some knelt, some leaned against rocks, and all of them watched the horizon, imagining the vast, untamed wilderness beyond. There was a quiet wonder in the way the wind moved through the grasses, how the sunlight played across the hills, how the clouds drifted slowly, effortlessly, as if they carried secrets older than time itself. And in that moment, they were both insignificant and infinite, small bodies against an immense world, yet deeply connected to its rhythms, its dangers, and its beauty. Evening came, painting the sky with gentle hues of purple and amber. Fires were lit, smaller than the night before, flickering low and soft. The hunters huddled close, sharing the first cuts of meat, tasting the reward of their courage and endurance. Words were few. They listened to the quiet crackle of flames, the distant murmur of the river, the rustle of unseen creatures moving through the darkness. And in that silence there was understanding, a meditation on the delicate balance of life. death and survival. They were not invincible, and yet, for a fleeting moment, they felt as though they had touched something eternal. Sleep returned slowly, tentative and dreamlike. The hunters' bodies rested, but their minds wandered the plains, revisiting the mammoth, the chase, the heart-stopping moments of fear and triumph. Dreams mixed with memory, with instinct, with a faint echo of something older than themselves. They dreamed of thunderous footsteps, of tusks gleaming in dawn light, of the immense, patient eyes of the beast. And through it all they felt the subtle pulse of the world, dangerous, beautiful, unyielding, and yet somehow theirs to navigate. And so the days continued, each one a meditation in motion, tracking prey, reading the subtle signs of the land, learning from each encounter, each misstep, each fleeting success. Every day was a test, every movement a lesson, every shared glance a reinforcement of the fragile trust that bound them together. The first great hunt had ended, yes, but the story of survival, courage and connection had only just begun. The days that followed were quiet in some ways, and yet every moment carried an unspoken tension. The plains, once silent except for the occasional rustle of grass, now seemed alive with the whispers of unseen dangers. Hunters moved with care, eyes scanning the horizon, ears straining for the faintest crack of a branch or distant cry of an animal. The first great hunt had taught them much, but it had also shown them how delicate their lives truly were. They were small figures against the vast, endless sweep of a land, their fates intertwined with creatures far larger and stronger than themselves. They practiced relentlessly, sharpening spears, reinforcing ropes, and revisiting the tactics they had used against the mammoth. Even the youngest among them began to understand that survival was as much a matter of patience and observation as it was of courage. Every rustle in the grass, every change in the wind, every broken twig told a story, and those who listened learned the language of the wild. The elders watched silently, guiding only when necessary, letting instinct and experience shape the hunter's understanding. One morning, as fog clung to the valleys, a low growl echoed from the distant tree line. Eyes widened, hearts skipped, and the hunters froze, a collective breath hanging between them. A pack of wolves emerged from the shadows, sleek and silent, eyes glinting with hunger and intelligence. The mammoth had been a teacher, yes, but the wolves were something different. Cunning, unpredictable, a reminder that the world demanded respect at every turn. The hunters crouched low, moving in silence, communicating through subtle gestures and glances. One wrong step, one careless motion, could mean the end. The encounter was brief, tense and exhilarating. Spears were readied, but no immediate attack came. The wolves circled, evaluating, testing, before slipping back into the forest, vanishing like shadows in the morning mist. Relief washed over the hunters, but it was tempered by understanding. The world was alive, yes, but it was also indifferent, and survival required constant vigilance. They had learned to face the unimaginable once. Now they knew it was a lesson that would repeat in countless forms, in creatures big and small, in moments expected and unforeseen. Evenings were quieter, reflective, spent around low fires that flickered against the cooling air. Hunters cleaned their tools, shared small portions of meat, and spoke softly, letting words carry memories, lessons and reflections. One hunter, still young, traced his fingers along a piece of mammoth hide, whispering to it as if it were a living companion. Another stared at the stars, mapping their constellations and listening to the wind as it whispered through the grasses, feeling the pulse of the earth beneath his feet. They were learning not just to survive, but to exist fully within a world that demanded attention, courage, and respect. Days merged into one another, each filled with small victories and near misses. They tracked smaller prey, learning stealth, patience, and the subtle art of reading animal behavior. Each hunt, no matter how minor, carried the weight of life and death, shaping their understanding of the land and their place within it. They learned to celebrate quietly, to respect their quarry, and to carry with them the memory of each encounter, each moment of tension, each heartbeat that had raced with fear and triumph. The first great hunt remained a shadow behind every step, a reminder of what was possible and what was at stake. The hunters often spoke of it in hushed tones, not to boast, but to teach. They spoke of strategy, of mistakes made and lessons learned, of the quiet strength that came from facing something larger than themselves and coming through changed. And in those stories, a subtle reverence developed, a recognition that they were part of something vast and ancient, a lineage of humans learning to navigate a world filled with danger and wonder. Night after night, as the fires dwindled and the cool air settled over the plains, the hunters drifted to sleep with hearts still beating in rhythm with the land. Dreams mingled with memory, the thunderous charge of the mammoth, the fleeting shapes of wolves, the endless expanse of grass and sky. And in those dreams they carried forward the lessons of courage, patience, and respect, knowing that each day was both a challenge and a gift, a chance to test themselves against the vast, unyielding world and to survive with grace, humility, and connection. Weeks passed, and the plains began to change. The air grew crisper in the mornings, carrying the faint, sharp scent of approaching winter. Grass yellowed at the edges, and the wind began to bite, teasing the skin beneath furs, reminding the hunters that the world was never static, never forgiving. They adjusted their routines, tracking not only the beasts but also the subtle shifts in the landscape, where the water pooled, where the grass grew thick, where the small animals burrowed for warmth. Every observation mattered. Every detail could mean the difference between life and death. The group had grown closer, shared experiences of fear, triumph, and exhaustion had created bonds as strong as any rope or spear. They moved almost instinctively together now, reading each other's gestures, anticipating each other's actions, a rhythm honed by necessity and survival. Around the fire at night, laughter was rare but cherished. It broke through the tension like sunlight through fog. Stories flowed naturally, of hunts past, of ancestors, of dreams. One hunter, older than the rest, often traced the constellations in the sky with a gnarled finger, naming them in ways only he remembered, connecting their lives to a lineage older than memory. Hunting grew more challenging. Smaller prey required patience, and the hunters learned to wait hours, sometimes days, hidden and motionless, breathing as quietly as the grass itself. Every rustle, every shift in shadow became a signal, a piece of a puzzle they were learning to read. It was slow work, a test of endurance and willpower, but it forged skills deeper than brute strength. The land demanded respect, and in return it offered lessons, sustenance, and the fragile thrill of connection. One morning, a faint track caught the elder's eye, deep impressions in soft earth, massive in scale, hinting at something approaching even larger than the mammoth they had first faced. The hunters leaned closer, whispers barely audible as they traced the path, imagining the creature it belonged to. Hearts quickened, not with fear alone, but with anticipation. This was a challenge, a test of everything they had learned, a chance to measure themselves against the unknown. They prepared carefully, sharpening weapons, reinforcing ropes, strategizing movements. Every decision carried weight. One mistake could unravel weeks of preparation, one misstep could cost a life. As the day progressed, the wind shifted, carrying scents from far-off forests and rivers. The hunters moved with deliberate stealth, crouching low, bodies pressing into the contours of the earth, blending with shadow and stone. The tracks led them into a valley framed by jagged cliffs, where sunlight dappled through sparse trees, casting a shifting pattern of light and shadow. Every sound seemed amplified, the crunch of leaves, the whisper of wind, the distant call of a bird startled into flight. Time slowed, awareness sharpened, each heartbeat echoed in their ears, a drumbeat of survival, anticipation, and fear. Even in these tense moments, small threads of humanity persisted. A young hunter paused to adjust the furs of another, brushing dirt from their shoulder. A shared glance carried reassurance. A quiet murmur reminded them that they were not alone. Fear and courage intertwined, grounding them in a fragile sense of trust that was more powerful than any weapon. The world beyond the valley could be merciless, but together they were stronger. By nightfall they had set up a temporary camp, low fires casting long shadows against the valley walls. Hunters huddled close, sharing small portions of food and whispers of strategy. The approaching creature loomed in their minds, massive, unseen, unpredictable. Dreams that night were restless, blending memory, imagination, and instinct. The flash of tusks in morning light, the heavy thud of massive feet, the thrill of anticipation tempered by the knowledge of fragility. In sleep their bodies rested, but their minds rehearsed, trained, and prepared. And through it all, a subtle understanding had taken root. Survival was never simply about the hunt. It was about observation, patience, respect, trust, and adaptation. It was about seeing the world clearly, moving with it rather than against it, and recognizing that danger was as much a teacher as the prey itself. The first great hunt had been a beginning, a spark, but the days, weeks, and months that followed shaped them more profoundly. Each encounter, each shadow, each heartbeat became part of the rhythm of life, a quiet testament to the courage, intelligence, and resilience of early humans. Days turned into weeks, and the landscape changed again. Frost began to lace the edges of leaves, and the rivers carried a sharper bite, reminding the hunters that the world was unforgiving, but also full of lessons. They moved with increasing awareness, every step deliberate, every sound noted. The elders often whispered to the younger ones, pointing out tracks, broken twigs, or subtle depressions in the earth, teaching them to read the world as if it were a living book. Each observation was a story, each mark a guide, and the hunters absorbed them with quiet reverence. The air carried distant echoes, howls, calls, and the faint drum of massive feet. They had learned patience. Hours passed, sometimes with little to show, and yet every moment mattered. The hunters spoke less, communicated more with gestures, glances, and subtle shifts in body weight. The bond between them strengthened with each shared breath, each silent acknowledgement of danger, and each lesson learned from the vast indifferent land. One afternoon, the wind shifted, carrying a scent that made hearts beat faster. The elders motioned the group into position, crouching behind rocks and dense shrubs. From a distance they glimpsed the outline of a colossal creature, a beast massive enough to rival the mammoth they had felled before, moving slowly, deliberately across the plains. Its tusks gleamed in the weak winter sun, its breath rising in plumes of frost. It was a test unlike any before, bigger, cleverer, and aware. The hunters held their spears tight, ropes coiled and ready, senses stretched to the edge of instinct. Time became elastic. Every rustle of wind, every snap of a branch, every distant cry seemed magnified. The young hunters, though trembling, felt a surge of something deep and ancient. Courage, awe, and the undeniable pull of destiny. They were part of a story larger than themselves, a dance with life and death that demanded attention, respect, and precision. The elders nodded, and the group moved as one, silent shadows slipping closer, every step a prayer and a calculation. The creature stopped, sniffing the air, sensing the hunter's presence. Its eyes met theirs across the distance, intelligent and aware. For a moment it seemed as though the world had frozen. Predator and prey, hunter and hunted, locked in a gaze that spanned time itself. Then the chase began. The ground shook beneath the creature's weight. The hunters darted left and right, rolling over rocks, leaping across streams, their coordinated movements a blend of learned skill and instinctual timing. Spears struck flesh and hide, ropes snagged and tightened, dust rose in clouds that clung to their hair and skin. Hours passed in a blur of motion, strategy, and endurance. Some hunters faltered, their bodies aching, their breaths ragged, but they pressed on. The elders guided silently, correcting errors with gestures, drawing on decades of experience. The younger ones learned quickly, adapting on the fly, improvising as instinct demanded. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, the beast faltered. Its massive body slowed, exhaustion creeping in. The hunters pressed forward, coordinated, precise, until at last, with a final monumental effort, it collapsed into the snow-covered earth. Silence returned, heavy and sacred, punctuated only by the laboured breathing of humans and the fading pulse of the fallen giant. They approached cautiously, reverence in every step. This hunt had tested them in ways the first could not, demanded courage, patience, and unity. They had risked everything, and yet, in the quiet aftermath, a profound sense of accomplishment settled over them. The beast would feed them, clothe them, and sustain their community. But more than that, it had taught them about themselves, the depth of their resilience, the power of trust, and the beauty of existence in a dangerous, indifferent world. The journey home was slow, deliberate, each step measured under the weight of the fallen giant. The hunters moved together, balancing pieces of meat and hides, ensuring nothing was lost. The winter air bit sharper now, each gust a reminder that survival was never simple, never guaranteed. Snow began to gather in patches, and the ground grew slippery underfoot. The hunters leaned on one another, passing heavy loads, steadying each other with quiet touches and whispered words. Every small act of care was a lifeline, a reminder that they were stronger together than apart. Hills and valleys stretched endlessly, the trees stripped bare, and the river glinting cold in the pale light. Yet even in the starkness, there was beauty. Frost sparkled on the grass, catching the weak sunlight like a scattering of tiny stars. Footprints, both theirs and those of countless animals, traced lines across the earth, connecting past and present, reminding the hunters that their lives were part of an ongoing story, one they could barely understand but deeply felt. At camp, preparations began in earnest. Fires were built, small and controlled, their warm glow reflecting off the ice and snow. The elders led the work, instructing the younger hunters in the careful process of dividing meat, tanning hides, and preserving bones for tools. Each action carried ritual significance, a mixture of necessity and reverence. Around the fire that night, conversation was sparse but meaningful. One hunter traced patterns in the snow with a stick, a slow, meditative gesture that seemed to echo the rhythm of their lives. Another whispered a story of an ancestor who had faced a storm that swallowed the sun, and the group listened, rapt, feeling the weight of memory and history pressing gently against the present. Even the youngest hunters, barely able to hold a spear, absorbed these lessons, internalizing them in ways that would shape their instincts, choices, and courage for years to come. The nights were long and cold, and sleep came in brief waves. Some lay close to the fire, while others curled against one another for warmth, breathing in the shared comfort of human presence. Dreams drifted in and out of consciousness. The thundering of massive feet, the glint of tusks, the pulse of the plains under their feet. The first hunt, the second, the lessons learned, all mingled in a quiet, hypnotic rhythm, shaping the minds and hearts of the hunters. They slept lightly, always alert to the whisper of wind, the snap of a branch, the distant cry of a predator, for survival required both rest and awareness, and there was no clear boundary between the two. Days turned into weeks. The hunters rotated through tasks, scouting, repairing shelters, tending to fires, observing smaller prey. Each day was a careful balance of labour, observation, and rest, a rhythm as ancient as the earth itself. Even in the harshest conditions, laughter occasionally broke through, the flicker of warmth in the cold, the subtle reassurance that life continued. Bonds deepened quietly, gestures of care, shared glances, subtle words of encouragement. Courage was not always loud. Sometimes it was the soft reassurance of presence, the trust that someone had your back when the world was at its most merciless. Through it all, the memory of the giant creatures lingered, not just as prey, but as teachers. The mammoth, the colossal beast they had tracked and felled, carried lessons that would echo in their lives forever. Patience, respect, courage, cooperation. They had faced something vast and unforgiving, and they had emerged changed. Each hunter carried these lessons differently, some in quiet reflection, some in meticulous practice, some in the stories they told by firelight, but all were touched by the understanding that life, in its rawest form, demanded both humility and audacity, observation and courage, fear and reverence. Evenings faded into nights where the stars shone brighter against the cold, clear skies. The hunters would sometimes sit silently, watching, listening, letting the rhythm of the universe seep into their bones. And in those moments, they understood something profound. The world was vast and dangerous, but it was also full of wonder, connection, and meaning. Every step, every breath, every heartbeat was part of a story older than themselves, one they were lucky enough to live and lucky enough to carry forward. Winter pressed in on the hunters like a quiet, relentless hand. Snow lay thick in some valleys, thin in others, and the rivers ran sharp and cold, threatening to freeze over at any moment. Food became scarce, and each step in the white, uneven ground required caution, calculation, and endurance. The hunters' bodies grew leaner, muscles taut from labour, hearts steady from constant alertness. Yet even in this hardship there was a rhythm, a strange, meditative order to the world that guided their movements and decisions. Tracking prey became a delicate dance. Each footprint in the snow was a message, each broken branch a clue. The hunters learned to read the whispers of the land, the faint bend of grass beneath a beast's weight, the scatter of stones that hinted at movement, the subtle shifts in wind direction that carried scent or sound. It was a slow, painstaking education, one that demanded patience, attention, and an intimacy with the world that few would ever know. And through it all they moved together, a single organism of observation and instinct, each hunter supporting the others, each learning in ways words could never convey. One day, distant movement caught the elders' eye. A massive figure trudged along the ridge, an animal larger and stronger than any they had tracked recently, its coat thick and dark, its breath steaming in the cold air. The hunters froze, each heartbeat amplified in their chests. This was not just another hunt. This was a test of everything they had learned, a confrontation that could shift the balance between life and death. They prepared silently, adjusting their furs, checking their spears, reinforcing ropes. Every small action was deliberate, a choreography honed by fear, respect, and instinct. The approach was tense and measured. The hunters moved like shadows across the frozen plains, careful not to disturb snow, careful not to alert their prey. Every step brought them closer, and yet the animal remained aware, ears flicking, nostrils quivering, eyes bright and intelligent. Time stretched and contracted. Minutes became hours in perception as the hunters inched forward, hearts pounding, muscles ready to spring, minds alert and calculating. Finally the hunt began. The creature bolted and the hunters surged, darting through the snow, rolling over icy ground, coordinating in silence, every movement instinctual, every decision vital. Spears flew, ropes snagged and tightened, the world a blur of white and shadow and motion. Exhaustion threatened, frost nipped at exposed skin, and yet they pressed on, driven by the knowledge that survival required both courage and cooperation. At one point the creature turned suddenly, tusks glinting, forcing the hunters to scatter and regroup. A young hunter stumbled, his breath ragged, and an elder was there instantly, steadying him, pulling him back into the flow. It was not just a hunt, it was a lesson in trust, unity, and perseverance. The land was unforgiving, the prey formidable, but the human spirit was resolute, flexible, and resilient. Hours later, as the sun dipped low and shadows stretched long across the snow, the beast faltered. The hunters converged carefully, every step measured, until finally the massive creature collapsed into the frozen earth. Silence fell, heavy and sacred, broken only by the ragged breathing of the hunters and the faint settling of snow on the ground. They approached slowly, reverence in every motion, understanding that this was more than a victory. It was a communion, a recognition of the delicate balance between life and death, fear and triumph, instinct and intellect. They worked through the night, preserving meat, preparing hides, and honouring the animal that had tested them so fiercely. Around the fire, stories were whispered, laughter and quiet sighs punctuating the cold air. Eyes met eyes, and in each glance was a shared acknowledgement. They had faced something immense and come through transformed. Each hunter carried a quiet pride, but also humility, knowing that courage alone was never enough. Observation, patience, trust, and respect were the true tools of survival. As sleep finally settled over the camp, the hunters lay quietly, letting warmth pass from body to body. Dreams carried echoes of the hunt, the thunderous steps of the beast, the flash of tusks, the sting of cold air, the pulse of adrenaline, and the slow, steady rhythm of hearts beating in unison. Through it all, a subtle truth lingered. The world was vast, dangerous, and beautiful, and they were alive within it, learning, surviving, and connecting in ways older than memory itself. Winter pressed in on the hunters like a quiet, relentless hand. Snow lay thick in some valleys, thin in others, and the rivers ran sharp and cold, threatening to freeze over at any moment. Food became scarce, and each step in the white, uneven ground required caution, calculation, and endurance. The hunters' bodies grew leaner, muscles taut from labour, hearts steady from constant alertness. Yet even in this hardship there was a rhythm, a strange, meditative order to the world that guided their movements and decisions. Tracking prey became a delicate dance. Each footprint in the snow was a message, each broken branch a clue. The hunters learned to read the whispers of the land, the faint bend of grass beneath a beast's weight, the scatter of stones that hinted at movement, the subtle shifts in wind direction that carried scent or sound. It was a slow, painstaking education, one that demanded patience, attention, and an intimacy with the world that few would ever know. And through it all they moved together, a single organism of observation and instinct, each hunter supporting the others, each learning in ways words could never convey. One day, distant movement caught the elder's eye. A massive figure trudged along the ridge, an animal larger and stronger than any they had tracked recently, its coat thick and dark, its breath steaming in the cold air. The hunters froze, each heartbeat amplified in their chests. This was not just another hunt. This was a test of everything they had learned, a confrontation that could shift the balance between life and death. They prepared silently, adjusting their furs, checking their spears, reinforcing ropes. Every small action was deliberate, a choreography honed by fear, respect, and instinct. The approach was tense and measured. The hunters moved like shadows across the frozen plains, careful not to disturb snow, careful not to alert their prey. Every step brought them closer, and yet the animal remained aware, ears flicking, nostrils quivering, eyes bright and intelligent. Time stretched and contracted. Minutes became hours in perception as the hunters inched forward, hearts pounding, muscles ready to spring, minds alert and calculating. Finally the hunt began. The creature bolted and the hunters surged, darting through the snow, rolling over icy ground, coordinating in silence, every movement instinctual, every decision vital. Spears flew, ropes snagged and tightened, the world a blur of white and shadow and motion. Exhaustion threatened, frost nipped at exposed skin, and yet they pressed on, driven by the knowledge that survival required both courage and cooperation. At one point the creature turned suddenly, tusks glinting, forcing the hunters to scatter and regroup. A young hunter stumbled, his breath ragged, and an elder was there instantly, steadying him, pulling him back into the flow. It was not just a hunt, it was a lesson in trust, unity, and perseverance. The land was unforgiving, the prey formidable, but the human spirit was resolute, flexible, and resilient. Hours later, as the sun dipped low and shadows stretched long across the snow, the beast faltered. The hunters converged carefully, every step measured, until finally the massive creature collapsed into the frozen earth. Silence fell, heavy and sacred, broken only by the ragged breathing of the hunters and the faint settling of snow on the ground. They approached slowly, reverence in every motion, understanding that this was more than a victory. It was a communion, a recognition of the delicate balance between life and death, fear and triumph, instinct and intellect. They worked through the night, preserving meat, preparing hides, and honouring the animal that had tested them so fiercely. Around the fire stories were whispered, laughter and quiet sighs punctuating the cold air. Eyes met eyes, and in each glance was a shared acknowledgement. They had faced something immense and come through transformed. Each hunter carried a quiet pride, but also humility, knowing that courage alone was never enough. Observation, patience, trust, and respect were the true tools of survival. As sleep finally settled over the camp, the hunters lay quietly, letting warmth pass from body to body. Dreams carried echoes of the hunt, the thunderous steps of the beast, the flash of tusks, the sting of cold air, the pulse of adrenaline, and the slow, steady rhythm of hearts beating in unison. Through it all, a subtle truth lingered. The world was vast, dangerous, and beautiful, and they were alive within it, learning, surviving, and connecting in ways older than memory itself. Winter pressed on, relentless and unyielding. Food grew scarce, and each day demanded more care, more observation, more patience. The hunters moved carefully across frozen plains and icy rivers, scanning for tracks, listening for movement, smelling the faintest hints of life on the wind. It was exhausting work, but even in hardship there was a rhythm, a quiet order to existence that carried them forward. Each footfall, each whispered gesture, each glance between hunters became part of a shared language, a dialogue born of trust, experience, and necessity. Tension lingered, subtle but constant. The younger hunters, despite their growing skills, struggled with fear. Some nights they shivered beside the fire, eyes wide, imagining predators lurking in the shadows. The elders watched silently, offering reassurance through touch, small smiles or gentle murmurs. No words were wasted. Lessons were conveyed in presence, in the steady heartbeat of someone who had survived countless seasons, and in the quiet observation of movement, posture, and instinct. Food was rationed carefully. Small game was hunted with patience, every action deliberate, every meal shared equally. The hunters had learned that survival demanded not just courage, but cooperation, respect, and careful calculation. Arguments were rare, silences frequent, and even in the quiet moments there was understanding. The world was dangerous, and division could be fatal. Bonds tightened in these days, woven from shared hardship and quiet trust. Every glance, every touch, every shared breath strengthened the invisible threads that held them together. And then came the whispers of the approaching giant, the final, elusive prey. Tracks appeared in the snow, enormous, deliberate, leaving impressions that made the hunters' hearts quicken with awe and trepidation. The elders studied them carefully, pointing out subtle cues to the younger hunters, the angle of the print, the depth in soft snow, the spacing that hinted at speed and intent. Every detail mattered. This was a hunt that demanded more than strength. It required patience, intelligence, and absolute coordination. Preparation began in earnest. Spears were sharpened to fine points, ropes checked and reinforced, and strategies were rehearsed in silence. Even movement became a practice. How to crouch without disturbing snow, how to step lightly over ice, how to anticipate the creature's patterns. The young hunters absorbed every instruction, their fear tempered by focus, their excitement tempered by respect. The elders watched closely, correcting small mistakes with gentle guidance, ensuring the group moved as one, a single organism honed by knowledge, instinct, and shared purpose. When the day of the hunt arrived, the sky was pale, almost silver, and the wind carried the scent of frost and distant forests. The hunters approached cautiously, hearts beating in quiet rhythm, bodies pressed low against the contours of the snow-covered ground. Every movement was deliberate, a meditation in motion. Time seemed suspended, a branch snapping, a distant howl, a flash of fur across the ridge, all magnified, all essential. The group moved in silence, connected by unspoken communication, intuition, and the memory of every challenge they had overcome together. And then they saw it. The beast emerged from the trees, enormous and imposing, its breath rising in clouds of frost, tusks gleaming in the pale light. Every hunter froze for a heartbeat, letting awe and fear wash over them before instinct took over. The coordinated surge began. Spears flew, ropes were cast and tightened. The ground trembled under immense weight, and the hunters moved as a single entity, precise and patient, weaving between snow and shadow. Each strike, each pull, each breath was a test, a calculation, a dialogue with life and death. Hours passed in a blur of effort and endurance. The creature was clever, relentless, testing their skills, patience, and courage. Some hunters faltered, some rose again, guided by instinct and the gentle touch of an elder's hand. Every near miss, every triumph, every heartbeat bound them closer, teaching lessons older than language, older than memory itself. Finally, exhaustion claimed the creature. It faltered, stumbled, and collapsed into the snow with a thundering silence that seemed to echo across the frozen plains. The hunters approached slowly, reverence in every step. It was over. Not just a hunt, but a journey of understanding, endurance, and transformation. They had faced the unimaginable and survived, and in that survival, they had learned about themselves, about one another, and about the delicate balance between life and the vast, untamed world around them. Around the fire that night, meat and hides shared carefully. The hunters spoke little. Eyes met eyes, hands brushed against each other in quiet acknowledgement, and the elders whispered stories of ancestors, of the land, of survival and courage. And in the flickering firelight, each hunter understood something profound, that life was fragile, beautiful, and fleeting. Yet the bonds they shared, the knowledge they carried, and the courage they embodied could endure, stretching beyond the frost, beyond the plains, into memory itself. Sleep came gently, almost reverently. Dreams carried echoes of thunderous footsteps, the glint of tusks, the pulse of adrenaline, and the rhythm of countless shared breaths. They dreamed not just of survival, but of belonging, of courage, of connection, and of the enduring dance between humans and the world around them, a dance as ancient as the earth, as fragile as frost, and as infinite as the stars overhead. Winter deepened, settling over the plains like a quiet white shroud. Frost crept along the edges of rivers, blanketed the grass and dusted the trees in crystalline lace. The hunters moved through this frozen world with practiced care, every step deliberate, every breath measured. Life had grown harder, yes, but there was a strange serenity in the rhythm of survival, a balance between hunger and perseverance, fear and courage, danger and wonder. Each day was a meditation, each moment a lesson, each heartbeat a reminder that existence was fragile and fleeting, yet endlessly precious. The aftermath of the great hunts lingered in the minds of the hunters. Meat and hides provided warmth and sustenance, but more importantly, the hunts had forged something invisible yet unbreakable: bonds. They moved together now with an ease born of trust and experience, anticipating one another's actions without a word, sharing burdens both physical and emotional. Even in moments of exhaustion or fear, the presence of another reminded them they were not alone. Survival demanded strength, yes, but also connection, empathy, and shared courage. Nights were long and cold, yet the fires glowed gently, flickering across frost-lined faces and snow-covered landscapes. The hunters sat close, sharing stories of ancestors, legends, and dreams, their voices low and melodic, blending with the whisper of the wind and the distant call of night creatures. Laughter occasionally broke through, brief and fragile, yet it lingered longer than the cold, a testament to human resilience, warmth, and the simple joy of presence. Each hunter carried the lessons of the hunts in their own way. Some etched them into memory as strategies, understanding how to track, ambush, and survive against immense creatures. Others absorbed the quiet teachings: patience, observation, respect, and humility. The elders watched all of this unfold, guiding subtly, their gestures and murmurs weaving knowledge into the younger hunter's consciousness. No words were wasted. Understanding grew naturally, silently, like frost creeping over winter grass. Food remained scarce, yet scarcity sharpened their awareness, their instincts, and their resourcefulness. They learned to read the subtle signs of small prey: tracks in the snow, broken twigs, and the faintest displacement of earth. They observed birds and smaller animals, understanding their patterns and using them as guides. The hunters moved in a delicate dance with life itself, aware that every step, every decision, every observation could mean survival or demise. And yet, even in scarcity there was beauty. A bird calling across a frozen valley, the silver sheen of ice on a stream, the distant glimmer of stars in the clear night sky. As the weeks of winter stretched on, the hunters' bond deepened beyond survival. They became a community not just of convenience, but of shared experience and trust. The young hunters who had once trembled at the howl of a distant wolf now moved with quiet confidence, their eyes sharp, bodies poised, and hearts steady. They had learned from failure, from fear, from triumph, and from the patient guidance of those who had lived longer and seen more. They understood the land not just as a place of danger, but as a teacher, a companion, and a mirror reflecting their courage, resilience, and humanity. The elders spoke often of legacy, not as a word, but as a feeling, a rhythm. They gestured to the skies and whispered stories of ancestors who had walked these plains, hunted these creatures, and survived countless winters. Each story was a lesson wrapped in memory, a map of courage and resilience, connecting the hunters to generations long past and those yet to come. The young ones listened, absorbing not only the content but the cadence, the weight, and the silent understanding embedded within each tale. The final hunt had left its mark on all of them. It was more than meat and hides, more than survival. It was proof of something deeper. They had faced something vast, intelligent, and formidable, and had emerged not only alive but transformed. Pride mingled with humility, courage with reverence, and fear with understanding. The hunters knew that they were part of a continuum, a lineage of humans learning to exist in harmony with a dangerous and beautiful world. They had risked everything, and in doing so had discovered what it meant to be human, to confront fear, embrace connection, and honor life in all its forms. As winter slowly yielded to the first hints of spring, the hunters moved across thawing rivers and softening plains. Life began to pulse again beneath the frozen ground. shoots of green piercing snow, insects stirring, small animals emerging. The hunters watched and listened, understanding that survival was never static. Every season demanded adaptation, patience and awareness, yet they faced the world not with trepidation, but with the quiet confidence of those who had learned, through hardship and risk, what it meant to live fully, attentively and bravely. Around the fire that marked the edge of the thawing plains, the hunters gathered for one last evening in winter. They shared food, stories, and silence, letting the warmth pass between them, letting the embers carry away fear, exhaustion, and uncertainty. They spoke softly, not needing words to express the depth of connection, respect, and understanding they now shared. Eyes met eyes, hands touched hands, and in the flickering light of the fire they glimpsed the vastness of life itself, dangerous, unpredictable, beautiful, and profoundly interconnected. And as sleep finally came, gentle and deep, the hunters lay quietly, letting dreams carry them across plains, forests, rivers, and mountains. They dreamed of massive beasts and fleeting shadows, of thunderous footsteps and whispered winds, of life lived at the edge of danger and the heart of courage. And in that dreaming, in the stillness of frost and fire, they understood something eternal, that to live fully one must embrace risk, cherish connection, and honour the delicate, fleeting, and magnificent pulse of the world around them. This was the rhythm of their lives, the heartbeat of early humans, the legacy of courage, patience, and wonder. And so the hunters slept, and the plains watched, silent and eternal, holding their stories, their triumphs, and their quiet, enduring humanity.